The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Silverbrook like a shroud, and Sarah Mitchell stood at her husband's grave, wondering if she had the strength to wear his badge. 3 months had passed since Sheriff Tom Mitchell was gunned down outside the First National Bank. 3 months since the town council had been locked in heated debate about who should replace him. What they hadn't expected was for his widow to step forward and demand the job herself. In 1882 Colorado Territory, women didn't wear badges, didn't carry guns in the line of duty, and certainly didn't face down outlaws in the dusty streets. But Sarah Mitchell was about to change all that, and before the sun set on this day, the entire town of Silverbrook would discover that sometimes the most unlikely person can become exactly the hero they need. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cemetery sat on a gentle rise east of town, where the morning sun could touch the weathered headstones and where the evening shadows would stretch long across the valley floor. Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the newest grave, her black dress spreading around her like spilled ink on the brown grass. The headstone was simple granite, carved with words that seemed inadequate for the man who had been her husband, her protector, and the conscience of Silverbrook for nearly 5 years. Thomas Mitchell, beloved husband and faithful servant of justice, taken too soon in the service of his community. The inscription blurred as tears threatened to fall again, but Sarah blinked them back with the same determination that had carried her through the funeral, through the condolences of well-meaning neighbors, and through the long nights when the silence of their empty house pressed against her like a physical weight. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the object that had brought her here this morning, the item that Mayor Harrison Cole had reluctantly handed over just yesterday after weeks of pressure from her and Deputy Frank Rodriguez. Tom's badge gleamed dully in the pale light, the 6-pointed star scratched and dented from years of faithful service. She had polished it the night before, working at each groove and surface until it shone like new, though she knew no amount of cleaning could remove the weight of responsibility it carried. "I don't know if I can do this, Tom," she whispered to the grave, her voice carried away by the mountain wind. "The whole town thinks I'm going to fail. Maybe they're right. Maybe a woman has no business wearing a badge, carrying a gun, trying to keep the peace in a place like this." She thought of the town council meeting 3 days ago, the heated voices and skeptical faces when she had stood before them in her best dress and announced her intention to serve as sheriff until the next election. Mayor Cole had nearly choked on his coffee, his round face reddening as he sputtered about propriety and tradition. Councilman Bradley had been more direct in his opposition, stating flatly that no woman could handle the rough men who frequented the Silver Dollar Saloon or face down armed outlaws without getting herself and innocent people killed. Only Deputy Rodriguez had spoken in her favor, his weathered face earnest as he told the council that Sarah had been Tom's closest confidant, that she understood the law and the challenges facing their community better than any of the men they might import from neighboring towns. He had also mentioned something the others chose to ignore, that Sarah Mitchell was one of the finest shots in the county, a skill Tom had insisted she develop after they married. The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the cemetery ground and rustling through the pine trees that surrounded the peaceful space. Sarah stood slowly, her joints stiff from kneeling on the cold ground, and pinned the badge to her dark blue wool dress. The metal felt heavier than she had expected, weighted with the authority it represented and the expectations of a town that largely believed she would fail. As she walked back down the hill towards Silverbrook, Sarah reflected on the events that had led to this moment. Tom's death had not been random violence or a crime of passion. 3 months ago, word had reached him that the Morrison gang was planning to rob the First National Bank, information that had come from a reliable source in the territorial capital, rather than wait for help from the county sheriff or federal Marshals, Tom had decided to handle the situation himself, positioning himself outside the bank early that morning with his rifle and his badge. The robbery had gone wrong from the start. Instead of the quick in-and-out job they had planned, the Morrison gang had found themselves facing an armed sheriff who refused to back down. The gunfight that followed had left 2 of the outlaws dead, but Tom had taken a bullet to the chest that proved fatal despite Doc Thompson's best efforts. The surviving members of the gang had escaped with most of the bank's money, and they remained at large despite the best efforts of territorial authorities. What troubled Sarah most was not just her husband's death, but the circumstances surrounding it. Tom had been a careful man, not given to reckless heroics or unnecessary risks. For him to face an entire gang alone suggested either a breakdown in judgment or information that had led him to believe backup was coming. In the weeks following his death, she had quietly asked questions around town, trying to understand what had happened and why, but the answers she received were vague and unsatisfying. Deputy Rodriguez had been on patrol in the eastern part of the county that morning, responding to reports of cattle rustling near the Garrison Ranch. Mayor Cole claimed to have been in Denver on town business, though Sarah had her doubts about that convenient absence. The bank president, Marcus Whitmore, had been deeply shaken by the robbery and seemed genuinely grief-stricken over Tom's death, but he also seemed eager to put the entire incident behind them and move on. As Sarah reached the outskirts of town, she could see smoke rising from the chimneys of houses and businesses, the daily life of Silverbrook beginning another day much as it had for the past 3 months. The town had grown considerably since she and Tom had arrived here 6 years ago, drawn by opportunities in cattle ranching and the rumors of silver strikes in the surrounding mountains. What had been a collection of rough buildings and temporary structures had evolved into a proper community with a church, a school, several businesses, and even a small newspaper. The railroad had arrived 2 years ago, bringing with it both prosperity and problems. Legitimate businessmen and families seeking new opportunities came on every train, but so did gamblers, confidence men, and outlaws looking for easy targets. Tom had worked tirelessly to maintain order and establish Silverbrook as a place where decent people could live and work in peace. But his death had created a vacuum that the town was struggling to fill. Main Street stretched before her already, busy with morning activity despite the early hour. Merchants were opening their stores, sweeping their sidewalks, and arranging displays in their windows. Horses and wagons moved up and down the dusty thoroughfare, carrying supplies and people about their daily business. The Silver Dollar Saloon was quiet at this hour, though Sarah knew it would be a different story by evening when the cowboys, miners, and railroad workers gathered to drink and blow off steam. The sheriff's office occupied a prime location in the center of town, a solid wooden building with barred windows and a small jail attached to the rear. Tom had been proud of that office, had spent considerable time and effort making it a symbol of law and order in a region where such things were often in short supply. The sight of it now, with its door closed and windows dark, struck Sarah as profoundly wrong. The heart of law enforcement in Silverbrook should not be empty and abandoned. As she approached the building, Sarah noticed Deputy Rodriguez's horse tied to the hitching post outside. Frank had been Tom's right hand for 3 years, a former cavalry soldier who had come west seeking a quieter life after his service in the Indian Wars. He was a good man, loyal and competent, but he lacked the presence and authority that Tom had brought to the job. More importantly, he had made it clear that he had no desire to be sheriff himself, preferring the support role that allowed him to do his duty without the political pressures and difficult decisions that came with ultimate responsibility. The door to the office was unlocked, and Sarah stepped inside to find Frank at Tom's desk, reviewing what appeared to be correspondence from territorial authorities. He looked up as she entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw the badge pinned to her dress. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, rising from his chair. You actually did it. You're really going to be our sheriff. The town council voted 3-2 in favor, Sarah replied, though she didn't mention that the deciding vote had come only after she threatened to petition the territorial governor directly. Mayor Cole wasn't happy about it, but he finally agreed to a trial period, 6 months to prove myself. Frank nodded approvingly. 6 months should be plenty of time for you to show these folks what you're made of. Tom always said you had more backbone than half the men in this town. The mention of her husband brought a familiar ache to Sarah's chest, but she pushed through it as she had learned to do over the past 3 months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What's the current situation, Frank? Anything I should know about immediately? Things have been quiet mostly, Frank replied, gesturing for her to take the chair across from the desk. Some drunk and disorderly last weekend, a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights that we managed to settle without it coming to blows. The Morrison gang hasn't been seen since that day. Territorial marshals think they might have headed south toward New Mexico. Sarah frowned as she settled into the chair. You don't sound convinced. I'm not, Frank admitted. Word is they lost most of their money in a poker game down in Colorado Springs about a month ago. If that's true, they'll be looking for another score soon, and they know this territory better than most. Plus, they have unfinished business here. What kind of unfinished business? Frank hesitated, then leaned forward in his chair. Sarah, there are things about that day, about Tom's death, that don't add up. I've been doing some quiet investigating, and I think there might have been more to that robbery than we originally thought. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the door to the office burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Mayor Cole stood in the doorway, his round face flushed and his usually immaculate appearance disheveled as if he had dressed hastily. Behind him stood 2 men Sarah didn't immediately recognize, both wearing the dusty clothes and hard expressions of men who had ridden through the night. Sheriff Mitchell, Mayor Cole said, the title clearly leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. We have a situation. One of the strangers stepped forward, a tall man with graying hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Ma'am, I'm Marshal James Patterson from the Territorial Capital. This here is Sheriff Bert Hawkins from Pine Creek. We've received word that the Morrison gang is heading this way, probably planning another robbery. Given the circumstances, Sheriff Hawkins has offered to take temporary jurisdiction over Silverbrook until this threat has passed. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she understood what was happening. Less than an hour after officially becoming sheriff, powerful men were already trying to push her aside. She looked at Sheriff Hawkins, noting his smug expression and the way his hand rested casually on his gun belt. He was the type of man who believed that authority came from the size of your reputation and the speed of your draw, not from the trust of the community you served. That's very generous of Sheriff Hawkins, Sarah replied calmly, but I don't believe Silverbrook needs outside help at this time. Deputy Rodriguez and I are perfectly capable of handling any threats to our community. Hawkins laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small office. Lady, I mean no disrespect, but you're talking about the Morrison gang. These are hard men who have killed lawmen in 3 territories. This isn't a job for someone playing dress-up with her dead husband's badge. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. She could feel Frank tensing beside her, ready to defend her honor, but she knew that this was a moment she had to handle herself. How she responded now would set the tone for her entire tenure as sheriff. Sheriff Hawkins, she said, rising from her chair and fixing him with a steady gaze. I appreciate your concern for our welfare, but I was legally appointed by the Town Council of Silverbrook to serve as sheriff. Unless you have a court order or territorial mandate that supersedes local authority, I suggest you concern yourself with your own jurisdiction. Marshal Patterson shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach some accommodation that ensures everyone's safety. There's nothing to discuss, Sarah replied firmly. And it's Sheriff Mitchell. I took an oath to protect this town, and that's exactly what I intend to do. Mayor Cole, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. Sarah, perhaps you should consider the marshal's suggestion. No one doubts your courage, but this situation might be more than any of us can handle. Sarah turned to face the mayor, noting the nervous sweat on his forehead and the way his eyes avoided hers. Mayor Cole, when you handed me this badge yesterday, you said I would have the full support of the town council for 6 months. Was that not the truth? Well, yes, but circumstances have changed. The territories feel that. The territorial authorities, Sarah interrupted, are not elected by the people of Silverbrook. I am, until the town council votes to remove me or my 6-month trial period expires. I am the sheriff. Here, and I will not be pushed aside by men who think a woman can't do the job. Sheriff Hawkins stepped closer, his hand moving closer to his gun. You're making a mistake, lady. When the Morrison gang comes calling, and they will, your pretty speeches won't stop bullets. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. With a knife, Frank's hand had moved to his own weapon, and Sarah could sense that this confrontation was on the verge of turning violent. She knew that what happened next would define not just her authority as sheriff, but her ability to function. In a world where respect was often measured by one's willingness to fight for it. Sheriff Hawkins, she said quietly, I think you and Marshal Patterson should leave now. If you have official business in Silverbrook, you can conduct it through proper channels. Otherwise, you're not welcome here. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Hawkins smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Fine, Sheriff Mitchell. We'll leave. But when this all goes to hell, remember that you were offered help and turned it down. As the 3 men filed out of the office, Mayor Cole paused at the door. Sarah, I hope you know what you're doing. The town council won't protect you if things go wrong. After they left, Sarah sank back into her chair, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. Frank moved to the window, watching as the men mounted their horses and rode out of town. That went well, he said dryly. You just made some powerful enemies, Sheriff. I've been making enemies since I was born a woman in a man's world. Sarah replied, The question is, what did you mean earlier about Tom's death? What doesn't add up? Frank returned to his chair, his expression serious. The timing for one thing. The Morrison gang hit that bank exactly 3 days after Tom received information about their plans. That's barely enough time for word to reach them that someone was onto their operation, but it would be enough time for someone to tip them off that Tom would be waiting. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You think someone in town warned them? I think it's possible. And there's something else. The money they stole? It wasn't just the bank's regular deposits. Marcus Whitmore had received a special shipment. The day before, a large cash transfer intended for some kind of land purchase. The robbery cleaned out not just the bank's operating funds, but this special shipment too. How much money are we talking about? Close to $50,000. According to Whitmore. That's enough to make the Morrison gang one of the richest outlaw bands in the territory. It's also enough to make someone very interested in ensuring that robbery succeeded. Sarah absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Frank, I want you to quietly gather everything you can about that special shipment. Who was it for, where it came from, who knew about it? And I want to know exactly who was where on the morning Tom was killed. You're thinking like a sheriff already, Frank said approvingly. What about the Morrison gang? If they really are heading back this way? Sarah stood and moved to the gun cabinet where Tom had kept the office weapons. She selected a Winchester rifle, checking its action and sights with practiced ease. Then we'll be ready for them. But Frank, I have a feeling that when they come, it won't be just about another robbery. I think they're coming back to finish what they started." As she spoke, the sound of rapid hoofbeats echoed from the street outside. Frank moved to the window again, then called out urgently, "Sarah, you need to see this." She joined him at the window and saw a lone rider approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his posture speaking of desperation. As he drew closer, she recognized Billy Santos, the teenage son of Maria Santos, who ran the Silver Dollar Saloon. The boy reined in his horse outside the office and practically fell from the saddle in his haste to reach the door. He burst into the office moments later, his young face pale with fear and exhaustion. "Sheriff Mitchell," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You gotta come quick. It's the Morrison gang. They've taken over Widow's Creek Station, and they're demanding that you come alone to face them, or they'll start killing hostages." Sarah felt the world shift around her as the reality of her situation crystallized. Less than 4 hours after pinning on Tom's badge, she was facing the same gang that had killed her husband, and they had made it personal. The test Sheriff Hawkins had warned her about was about to begin, and the whole town would be watching to see if the widow sheriff would succeed or fail. She reached for her gun belt, the weight of the Colt revolver familiar and comforting against her hip. "Frank, gather whoever you can trust and follow me out there, but stay back unless I signal otherwise. This is something I have to do myself. Sarah, you can't seriously be thinking of going out there alone. It's exactly what they want, and it's probably a trap." "Of course it's a trap," she replied, checking her weapons one final time. "But sometimes walking into a trap is the only way to spring it. Besides, I made a promise to Tom and to this town. It's time to keep it." As word spread through Silverbrook that their new sheriff was riding out to face the Morrison gang alone, people began gathering in the streets to watch her departure. Some faces showed skepticism, others showed fear, and a few showed something that might have been hope. Sarah Mitchell had asked for the chance to prove herself as sheriff, and fate had just handed her the ultimate test. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist and promising a clear, bright day. As Sarah mounted her horse and rode toward whatever awaited her at Widow's Creek Station, she carried with her not just the weight of a badge and the expectations of a doubtful town, but the memory of a good man who had died believing that justice was worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. The story of the widow sheriff was about to begin in earnest, and before the day was over, everyone in Silverbrook would know whether Sarah Mitchell had what it took to fill her husband's boots, or whether some jobs really were too big for a woman to handle. The ride to Widow's Creek Station took Sarah through terrain that had once seemed peaceful and familiar, but now felt charged with menace. The narrow canyon road wound between towering pine trees and granite outcroppings, places where ambushes could be waiting behind every bend. Her horse, a sturdy mare named Belle that Tom had given her on their second wedding anniversary, seemed to sense her tension and moved with careful, measured steps along the rocky path. Widow's Creek Station had been established 2 years ago as a way station for travelers heading deeper into the mountains toward the mining camps. It consisted of a main building that served as both inn and general store, a stable for horses, and several smaller structures that provided basic accommodations for those who couldn't afford a room in the main building. The station was run by an elderly couple, Heinrich and Greta Mueller, German immigrants who had come west seeking opportunity and had found it in providing services to miners and travelers. As Sarah crested the final ridge before the station came into view, she could see smoke rising from the chimney of the main building, a normal sight that somehow seemed ominous given the circumstances. She reined in Belle and studied the scene below through a pair of field glasses Tom had carried during his time as sheriff. The station appeared quiet, almost peaceful, but she could see horses tethered near the stable that didn't belong to the Mullers. More telling was the absence of any activity around the buildings, an unnaturally still quality that suggested people were being kept inside against their will. Sarah counted at least 6 horses, which meant the Morrison gang had likely been reinforced since their last encounter with law enforcement. She knew from Tom's files that the original gang had consisted of 5 men, but outlaw bands were fluid organizations that often picked up new members between jobs. The thought of facing 6 or more armed men alone should have terrified her. But instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her. The same focused clarity she had experienced during her best performances at the county shooting competitions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from behind caused her to wheel Belle around, her hand moving instinctively to her gun. Relief flooded through her when she saw Deputy Rodriguez riding toward her, followed by 3 other men she recognized. From town, Frank had chosen his backup carefully, she noted with approval. Doc Thompson carried his medical bag along with a rifle, understanding that his services might be needed regardless of how the confrontation played out. Jake Warren, the half-Cherokee horsebreaker who lived on the outskirts of town, had brought his reputation as one of the finest shots in the territory. The third man was Miguel Santos, Maria's brother, and a former soldier who had served with distinction in the cavalry. "I thought I told you to stay back," Sarah said as Frank pulled his horse alongside hers. "You did, and we will," Frank replied firmly. "But we're not letting you ride into this completely alone. Jake knows these mountains better than anyone, and he's spotted at least 3 lookouts posted on the ridges around the station. Miguel and Doc Thompson will position themselves where they can provide covering fire if things go bad." Jake Warren spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent years tracking dangerous game through difficult country. "Sheriff, there's something you should know about the setup down there. They're not just holding hostages, they're using the station as a fortress. They've barricaded the doors and windows, and they have clear lines of sight in all directions. This isn't just about drawing you out for a fight. It's about making sure they control every aspect of the confrontation." Sarah absorbed this information, her mind working through the tactical implications. "How many hostages?" "Hard to say for certain," Jake replied, "but I saw movement in the main building that suggests at least 4 or 5 people being held inside. The Mullers, probably, and whoever else was staying at the station when the gang arrived." Doc Thompson shifted nervously in his saddle. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you sure about this? These men killed Tom, and they're clearly prepared for a fight. Maybe we should send for help from the territorial authorities." "By the time help arrives, those hostages could be dead," Sarah replied simply. "Besides, this is exactly what they want, for me to show that I can't handle the job, that Silverbrook needs outside protection. If I back down now, I'll never have the authority to function as sheriff." Miguel Santos, who had remained silent during the discussion, finally spoke up. "My sister Maria thinks very highly of you, Sheriff Mitchell. She says you have the heart of a warrior and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to think. What does your wisdom tell you now?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The rational part of her mind was screaming that this was exactly the kind of situation that required backup, reinforcements, and careful planning. But another part of her, the part that had learned to shoot from Tom and had absorbed his lessons about law enforcement, recognized that sometimes a badge was more than a piece of metal. It was a symbol of the community's faith in justice. If she failed that faith now, it might never be restored. "My wisdom tells me that sometimes you have to trust in something bigger than yourself," she said finally. "Frank, I want you and the others positioned where you can see what's happening, but far enough back that you won't be caught in crossfire. If I go down, your job is to get those hostages out alive and then bring real help to finish this." Before Frank could protest, Sarah spurred Belle forward and began the descent toward Widow's Creek Station. The path was exposed for the final 100 yards, a deliberate design feature that allowed the station operators to see visitors approaching and prepare appropriate welcomes. Now that same openness made Sarah feel like a target in a shooting gallery, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace and keep her hands visible and away from her weapons. As she approached the main building, a voice called out from inside, rough and mocking. Well, if it isn't the famous widow sheriff. Took you long enough to get here, lady. We were starting to think you might be too scared to show up." Sarah reined in Belle about 30 feet from the building's front porch, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough back to give herself room to maneuver if shooting started. "I'm here," she called back. "Let the hostages go, and we can settle this between us." Harsh laughter echoed from the building. "Oh, we'll settle it, all right. But first, you need to understand the rules. You're going to drop your guns and come inside, nice and peaceful like. Then we're going to have ourselves a conversation about respect and knowing your place." "I don't think so," Sarah replied calmly. "If you want to talk, come outside where we can see each other. Otherwise, turn loose the innocent people you're holding and ride out of my territory." The response was immediate and vicious. A rifle shot cracked from one of the barricaded windows, the bullet kicking up dirt just in front of Belle's hooves. Sarah's horse danced nervously but held her ground, a testament to the training Tom had insisted on for all their animals. "Next!" "Shot won't be a warning," the voice inside shouted. "Now drop those guns and get inside before we start sending out pieces of these good folks." Sarah's mind raced through her options, none of them particularly appealing. The gang clearly had no intention of allowing a fair fight or honoring any kind of negotiated settlement. They wanted to humiliate her, to break her spirit before they killed her, probably as a message to any other community that might think about appointing a female sheriff. The hostages were leverage, but they were also the reason she couldn't simply withdraw and wait for reinforcements. "All right," she called out, beginning to dismount from Belle. "I'm coming in. But if any of those people are harmed, this ends badly for all of you." "You're not exactly in a position to make threats, lady," came the reply, but Sarah detected a note of satisfaction in the voice. They thought they had won, that she was surrendering to their superior position and firepower. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had never learned to surrender, not when she was the only girl in her mathematics classes, not when she had insisted on learning to shoot despite her mother's objections, and not when she had demanded the right to serve as sheriff despite the town's skepticism. Sometimes the best way to win a fight was to let your opponents think they had already won. As she walked toward the building, her hands raised but not quite touching the sky, Sarah's mind cataloged every detail of the station's layout. She had been here several times with Tom, both on official business and for the occasional social visit with the Mullers. The main building had 2 entrances, front and back, with a large common room that served as dining area and gathering space. Upstairs were 4 small bedrooms that the Mullers rented to travelers, while the ground floor also contained their private quarters and a kitchen that opened onto a covered porch overlooking the creek. The front door opened as she approached, revealing a man she recognized from wanted posters as Caleb Morrison himself, leader of the gang that had killed her husband. He was younger than she had expected, probably not yet 30, with sandy hair and pale blue eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He wore 2 guns, tied low in the manner of someone who made his living with violence, and his clothes were dusty from hard riding. Well, Morrison said, looking her up and down with obvious contempt. "So you're the famous widow sheriff. Gotta say, you don't look like much. Hard to believe you've caused us so much trouble." Sarah stepped onto the porch, noting the positions of the other gang members she could see. 2 men flanked the main room's windows, rifles trained on the area where she had been standing moments before. A 3rd man stood near what she assumed were the hostages, his gun drawn and ready. She couldn't see the others, but Jake Warren had spotted at least 6 horses, which meant at least 3 more men were positioned elsewhere in the building or outside. "Where are the hostages?" she asked, ignoring Morrison's taunts. "Safe and sound for now," Morrison replied. "Old Heinrich and his wife are upstairs, along with a traveling salesman who had the bad luck to be here when we arrived. There's also a young couple on their way to get married in Pine Creek, real sweet and romantic. Be a shame if something happened to spoil their wedding plans." The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you want, Morrison? You've got me here, you've made your point. Let them go." Morrison's smile was as cold as winter wind. "What I want, Sheriff, is for you to understand that there are consequences when people interfere with my business. Your husband learned that lesson the hard way. Now it's your turn. My husband died doing his job, protecting innocent people from men like you. Your husband died because he was a fool who thought a badge made him bulletproof." Morrison snapped, his facade of casual menace slipping for a moment. "Just like you're a fool who thinks she can wear a man's job like a pretty dress." Sarah took another step closer, her hands still raised but her posture shifting subtly, weight moving to the balls of her feet in preparation for sudden movement. "The only fool here is the man who thinks holding innocent people hostage makes him strong." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped as one of his men called out from inside the building. "Boss, we got riders coming up the back trail. Looks like maybe 4 or 5 of them." Frank and the others, Sarah realized. They were moving into position as planned, but their presence might escalate the situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. She needed to end this quickly, before more people were put at risk. "Looks like your backup is arriving," Morrison said, his hand now resting on the butt of his pistol. "Too bad they're too late to help you." What happened next occurred in the space of a heartbeat, though Sarah would remember it in slow, crystalline detail for the rest of her life. Morrison's hand moved for his gun with the practiced speed of a professional killer, his eyes already calculating the angle and distance for a killing shot. But Sarah had been preparing for this moment since the conversation began, her body coiled and ready despite her seemingly passive stance. Instead of trying to outdraw Morrison, she threw herself sideways off the porch, rolling behind the stone foundation that supported the building's corner. Morrison's first shot splintered the wooden post where her head had been a split second earlier, and his curse echoed across the mountain stillness as he realized his target had escaped. "Kill her," he shouted to his men, and suddenly the morning air was filled with the crack of rifle fire and the whine of bullets striking stone and wood. Sarah found herself in a position that was both better and worse than she had hoped. The stone foundation provided solid cover from the building, but it also trapped her in a relatively small space with limited options for movement. She could hear Morrison and his men moving inside, repositioning themselves to get clear shots at her hiding place. More concerning was the fact that she couldn't see what was happening to the hostages during the confusion. A bullet struck the stone near her head, sending chips of granite flying. Sarah pressed herself lower against the foundation and drew her Colt revolver, checking its loads with hands that were surprisingly steady. Tom had drilled into her the importance of remaining calm during gunfights, of making every shot count. When ammunition was limited and reload time might mean the difference between life and death. From her position, she could see part of the stable where the gang's horses were tethered. If she could reach that building, she would have better cover and multiple escape routes, but the distance was at least 50 yards of open ground. On the other hand, if she stayed where she was, she would eventually be outflanked and killed. The decision was made for her when one of Morrison's men appeared at the corner of the building, rifle raised and aimed at her hiding spot, Sarah's. First shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Her second shot, fired as he tried to draw his sidearm, put him down permanently. The brief exchange revealed her position and brought a renewed volley of fire from the building. Sarah sprinted for the stable, zigzagging to make herself a more difficult target, her boots slipping on loose gravel as bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. she made it to the relative safety of the stable walls, just as Frank Rodriguez and his men opened fire from their positions on the surrounding ridges. Inside the stable, Sarah found herself among nervous horses that whinnied and stamped. At the sound of gunfire, she moved to the far end of the building, where a small window gave her a view of the station's back entrance. As she had hoped, the crossfire from Frank's position was forcing the gang members to take cover, reducing their ability to maintain focused fire on her position. Through the window, she could see movement in the station's kitchen, and her heart leaped when she recognized Heinrich Muller's distinctive white beard. The old man was trying to shield his wife and the other hostages from the shooting, but they were dangerously exposed if the fight continued much longer. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just hours earlier. Instead of waiting for the gunfight to resolve itself, she was going to end it. The back door of the station was less than 30 feet from the stable, and if she could reach it during the confusion, she might be able to get inside and turn the tables on Morrison's gang. She checked her weapons one more time, making sure her rifle was loaded and her spare ammunition was easily accessible. Then she waited for the right moment, when the covering fire from Frank's position was at its heaviest and Morrison's men were forced to keep their heads down. When that moment came, Sarah burst from the stable and sprinted toward the station's back door. Bullets whined around her, but the gang's aim was hurried and inaccurate. She hit the back door at full speed, her shoulder driving into the wood, with enough force to splinter the frame and send the door flying open. Inside, she found herself face to face with one of Morrison's men, a bearded outlaw who was just turning toward the sound of the breaking door. Sarah's rifle spoke before he could bring his weapon to bear, and he dropped like a stone. The interior of the station was a maze of overturned furniture and defensive positions, with Morrison's remaining men scattered throughout the building. Sarah could hear the hostages somewhere upstairs, Heinrich Muller's voice trying to calm his terrified wife and the other captives. She needed to reach them before Morrison decided to use them as human shields. Moving carefully through the building, Sarah encountered two more gang members in quick succession. The first was crouched behind the bar that served the stations. Drinking customers, rifle trained on the front windows where he had been returning Frank's covering fire. Sarah's approach from behind gave her a crucial advantage, and her shot ended his participation in the fight before he knew she was there. The second man was more alert, positioned at the foot of the stairs leading to the guest rooms, where the hostages were being held. He turned as Sarah entered the main room, his pistol already in his hand, but her rifle was faster and more accurate. The shot echoed through the building like thunder, and suddenly the gunfire from outside seemed very distant and unimportant. "Morrison!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly through the building. "It's over. Your men are down, and you're surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and nobody else has to die." The response was a gunshot from upstairs, followed by Morrison's voice, harsh with rage and desperation. "Like hell it's over. I've got 5 innocent people up here, and if you don't throw down your weapons and walk out that front door, I'm going to start sending them down one at a time." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. This was the scenario she had most feared, the moment when Morrison's desperation would turn him into a rabid animal willing to kill anyone within reach. She could hear movement upstairs, Morrison positioning himself and his remaining men for a final stand that would almost certainly cost innocent lives. But as she stood in the bullet-scarred main room of Widow's Creek Station, surrounded by the bodies of men who had chosen violence over justice, Sarah Mitchell realized that she was no longer the uncertain widow who had pinned on her husband's badge that morning. She was the sheriff of Silverbrook, and she had a job to finish. The sound of Frank Rodriguez calling her name from outside reminded her that she wasn't completely alone, but she knew that what happened next would define not just her authority as sheriff, but her ability to live with herself regardless of how this confrontation ended. Morrison had made his choice when he decided to hold innocent people hostage. Now it was time for her to make hers. Sarah began climbing the stairs toward the second floor, her rifle ready and her resolve as hard as the mountain granite that surrounded Widow's Creek Station. Behind her lay the evidence of her capability as a law officer, the proof that she could hold her own in a gunfight when justice demanded it. Ahead lay the final test of whether she could save the innocent while bringing the guilty to account. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she climbed, each sound seeming to echo through the building like a drumbeat. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway ran the length of the building, with 4 doors opening off it to the guest rooms. Sarah could hear voices behind one of the doors, Morrison talking in low, urgent tones to someone else, probably giving instructions to his last remaining gang member. As she reached the landing, one of the doors burst open and Morrison himself stepped into the hallway, a Colt revolver in each hand and murder in his pale blue eyes. Behind him, Sarah could see the shadowy figures of the hostages, pressed against the far wall of the room in terror. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of his situation. "The widow sheriff just doesn't know when to quit. Your husband had the same problem, you know. Couldn't leave well enough alone. Couldn't mind his own business." "My husband died protecting innocent people," Sarah replied, her rifle trained on Morrison's chest. "He died doing what was right. He died being stupid," Morrison snapped. "Just like you're about to die. The only difference is, when I'm done with you, those good folks behind me are going to join you, and it'll be your fault for not walking away when you had the chance." Sarah knew she was looking at a man with nothing left to lose, the most dangerous kind of opponent in any confrontation. Morrison's gang was finished, his reputation was in ruins, and his only remaining option was to take as many people with him as possible. But she also knew that backing down now would mean the certain death of innocent people and the destruction of everything Tom had worked to build in Silverbrook. "Let them go, Morrison," she said quietly. "This is between you and me. It always has been." Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? The brave little woman standing up to the big, bad outlaw. But you know what you really are? You're a joke. A joke that's about to get a lot of good people killed." The hallway seemed to contract around them, 2 figures facing each other across a distance measured in feet but representing a gulf between justice and lawlessness that could never be bridged. Sarah could feel her heart beating steadily in her chest, could hear the frightened breathing of the hostages behind Morrison, could sense the weight of history balancing on the edge of whatever happened next. When Morrison moved, it was with the lightning speed of a professional gunfighter, both hands bringing his weapons to bear in a display of skill that had probably ended dozens of lives across the territories. But Sarah Mitchell had learned to shoot from a man who believed that accuracy mattered more than speed, that a steady hand and clear mind could overcome raw talent when the stakes were high enough. Her single shot echoed through the hallway like the voice of justice itself, and Caleb Morrison, leader of the gang that had terrorized 3 territories and killed the best sheriff Silverbrook had ever known, crumpled to the floor and moved no more. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah could hear Heinrich Muller's voice speaking softly in German, probably a prayer of thanksgiving. From outside came the sound of approaching footsteps as Frank Rodriguez and the others finally felt safe enough to enter the building. But for Sarah, the most important sound was the absence of gunfire, the blessed quiet that meant innocent people would live to see another day. As she stood in the upstairs hallway of Widow's Creek Station, smoke still curling from the barrel of her rifle, Sheriff Sarah Mitchell realized that she had passed a test that few people ever faced. She had looked evil in the eye and had not blinked. She had stood for justice when it would have been easier to step aside. Most importantly, she had proven to herself and to anyone who cared to notice that sometimes the most unlikely person could become exactly the hero a community needed. The badge on her chest caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through a nearby window, and for the first time since Tom's death, Sarah felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as an honor. She was the sheriff of Silverbrook, and she had earned the right to wear that title through fire and blood, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught, only discovered when circumstances demanded nothing less than everything a person had to give. When Frank Rodriguez finally reached the upstairs hallway, he found Sarah helping Heinrich Mueller tend to his wife, who had fainted during the final confrontation. The other hostages, the traveling salesman and the young engaged couple, were shaken but unharmed, their gratitude evident in their faces as they realized their ordeal was finally over. "Sarah," Frank said quietly, looking at the scene of carnage that surrounded them, "I've been a lawman for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. Tom would be proud." Sarah looked up from where she was kneeling beside Greta Mueller, her hands gentle as she helped the older woman recover from her faint. "Tom taught me that being a peace officer isn't about being the fastest gun or the toughest fighter. It's about being willing to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them, no matter what the cost." As they prepared to leave Widow's Creek Station, Sarah took one last look around the building that had become the site of her baptism by fire as sheriff. The Morrison gang was finished, their reign of terror ended by a woman they had dismissed as weak and ineffective. But more importantly, the people of Silverbrook now had proof that their new sheriff could handle whatever challenges the territory might throw at her. The ride back to town was quiet, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. For Sarah, the silence provided time to process the magnitude of what had happened, and to prepare for the reactions she would face when word of the confrontation spread through the community. As they crested the final ridge before Silverbrook came into view, Sarah could see people gathered in the streets, waiting for news of the confrontation at Widow's Creek Station. Some of those faces would show relief when they learned the Morrison gang had been eliminated. Others might show surprise that a woman had accomplished what territorial authorities and experienced lawmen had failed to do. But Sarah knew that from this day forward, when people in Silverbrook looked at her badge, they would see not just a woman trying to fill her husband's shoes, but a sheriff who had proven herself capable of protecting her community against any threat. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains as Sheriff Sarah Mitchell rode back into Silverbrook, her rifle across her saddle and the respect of her community finally truly earned. The widow who had pinned on a badge that morning was gone, replaced by a law officer who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. The real work of building a safer, more just community was just beginning, but Sarah Mitchell now knew, beyond any doubt, that she was equal to whatever challenges lay ahead. The badge on her chest caught the last rays of sunlight as she rode down Main Street, and for the first time since Tom's death, Sarah allowed herself to believe that justice could indeed prevail in a hard land, and that sometimes the most unlikely sheriff could become exactly the hero a town needed most. The news of the Morrison gang's elimination spread through Silverbrook like wildfire, carried by riders who had witnessed the aftermath at Widow's Creek Station and embellished with each telling. By evening, the Silver Dollar Saloon was packed, with townsfolk eager to hear first-hand accounts from Deputy Rodriguez and the other men who had accompanied Sheriff Mitchell on what was already being called the most significant law enforcement action in the territory's recent history. Sarah herself had retreated to the quiet of the sheriff's office, where she sat at Tom's old desk trying to process the day's events. The paperwork alone was staggering. Territorial authorities needed to be notified, reports filed, and arrangements made for the bodies of the gang members. More immediately pressing was the question of what to do about the $50,000 that had been recovered from the Morrison gang's saddlebags, money that almost certainly represented the proceeds from the bank robbery that had claimed Tom's life. Marcus Whitmore, the bank president, had arrived at the office within an hour of Sarah's return to town, his normally composed demeanor cracked by barely contained excitement. The recovery of the stolen funds would save his institution from potential ruin, but Sarah had noticed something troubling in his eagerness to reclaim the money. When she had asked him about the special shipment that had been in the bank the day of the robbery, Whitmore had become evasive, claiming the details were confidential business matters that didn't concern law enforcement. Frank Rodriguez entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "You've been sitting here for 3 hours without saying much of anything," he observed, setting one of the cups in front of Sarah. "That's not like you." "I've been thinking," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "About what you said earlier regarding Tom's death, about things not adding up. Recovering that money has raised more questions than it's answered." Frank settled into the chair across from the desk, his weathered face thoughtful. "Such as?" Sarah pulled out a ledger she had been studying, one of several books Tom had kept detailing his investigations and observations about criminal activity in the territory. According to Tom's notes, the Morrison gang's usual pattern was to rob banks or stages, spend the money quickly on gambling and drinking, then move on to the next job. They weren't known for careful planning or long-term thinking. "That's consistent with what we knew about them," Frank agreed. "They were more opportunistic than methodical." "Then explain this," Sarah said, opening the ledger to a page covered with Tom's careful handwriting. 3 weeks before the bank robbery, Tom received information that the Morrison gang was planning to hit our bank specifically. Not just any bank in the territory, but ours. The source of that information was someone who claimed to have overheard gang members discussing the job in a saloon in Colorado Springs. Frank leaned forward, studying the page. "I remember Tom mentioning that tip, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Tips like that come in fairly regularly, and most of them turn out to be false alarms or cases of mistaken identity. But this one was different," Sarah continued. "The tipster knew specific details about the bank's layout, about the timing of cash deliveries, about security procedures that wouldn't be common knowledge." Tom noted that the information was too accurate to be casual saloon gossip. Understanding began to dawn in Frank's eyes. "You think someone with inside knowledge was feeding information to the Morrison gang?" "I think someone wanted that robbery to succeed," Sarah said firmly. "And I think they wanted Tom dead to ensure he couldn't investigate too deeply into what was really stolen." Before Frank could respond, the office door opened and Mayor Cole stepped inside, his round face beaming with an expression of magnanimous satisfaction. Behind him came 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, both dressed in expensive suits that marked them as visitors from the territorial capital, or perhaps even Denver. "Sheriff Mitchell," Mayor Cole announced grandly. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Charles Brennan and Mr. Edward Hastings from the Territorial Banking Commission. They've come to personally commend you for your outstanding work in recovering the stolen bank funds." Sarah rose from her chair, noting that neither visitor seemed particularly pleased to be making this visit. Brennan was a thin, sharp-faced man with calculating eyes, while Hastings appeared nervous and kept glancing around the office as if looking for escape routes. "Gentlemen," Sarah acknowledged politely, "I appreciate your making the journey to Silverbrook, though I'm not sure the situation requires such high-level attention." Brennan's smile was as cold as January wind. "On the contrary, Sheriff Mitchell, the recovery of such a substantial sum requires careful documentation and oversight. We need to ensure that every dollar is properly accounted for and returned to its rightful owners." "I assumed the money would be returned to the bank," Sarah said carefully. "It was stolen from the First National during the robbery." "Well, yes," Hastings interjected nervously, "but the situation is somewhat more complicated than that. You see, the special shipment that was taken contained funds belonging to several different parties, and sorting out the various claims may take some time." Frank Rodriguez had remained silent during this exchange, but Sarah could see suspicion growing in his eyes. "What kind of different parties?" she asked. Brennan's expression grew even more guarded. That's confidential information. Sheriff, banking regulations prevent us from discussing the details of our clients' transactions. Sarah felt a familiar chill, the same instinct that had warned her of danger during the confrontation with the Morrison gang. Mr. Brennan, 3 months ago, my husband was killed trying to prevent that robbery. I think I have a right to know what he died protecting. Your husband died doing his duty as a peace officer, Brennan replied stiffly. That should be sufficient motivation without needing to know the details of bank business. The dismissive tone in Brennan's voice triggered something in Sarah, a flash of anger that she struggled to keep under control. My husband died because someone with inside knowledge set him up. Someone who knew about that special shipment and wanted to ensure the robbery succeeded. Mayor Cole looked genuinely shocked. Sarah, that's a very serious accusation. Surely you don't think someone in Silverbrook would be involved in such a scheme. I think, Sarah said slowly, that $50,000 is enough money to make people do things they wouldn't normally consider. And I think the fact that territorial banking officials are here within hours of the money's recovery suggests that more than routine bank business is involved. Brennan's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Sheriff Mitchell, I strongly advise you not to pursue this line of thinking. The territorial government takes a very dim view of local officials who exceed their authority or interfere with legitimate business operations. Is that a threat, Mr. Brennan? It's a friendly warning, Brennan replied, though his tone suggested anything but friendliness. You've had a very successful day, Sheriff. Don't ruin it by chasing shadows and conspiracy theories. After the tow, 3 men left. Sarah and Frank sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. Finally, Frank spoke up. Those men were scared, Sarah. Scared and trying very hard not to show it. They were also lying, Sarah added. Did you notice how nervous Hastings was when I mentioned the special shipment? And Brennan's reaction when I suggested inside knowledge was involved? Frank nodded. What do you want to do about it? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her options. As sheriff, she had the authority to investigate crimes within her jurisdiction, but she also had to be careful not to overstep her bounds and create problems for the community she served. On the other hand, if Tom had been killed as part of a larger conspiracy, she owed it to his memory and to the principles of justice to uncover the truth. I want you to quietly contact that source of Tom's in Colorado Springs, she said finally. The one who provided the original tip about the Morrison gang. See if he's willing to talk about how he came by that information. That could be dangerous, Frank warned. If there really is a conspiracy involved, asking questions might put you in the same position Tom was in. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But Tom taught me that sometimes the only way to honor a badge is to be willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. If people in positions of authority are covering up crimes, then the innocent people are the ones who suffer. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Sarah called out permission to enter, and was surprised to see Jake Warren step inside, his usually calm demeanor marked by obvious concern. Sheriff, Jake said, removing his hat respectfully, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but there's something you need to know. I was just at the Silver Dollar having a drink with Miguel Santos, and we overheard a conversation that I think you should hear about. Sarah gestured for him to take a seat. What kind of conversation? Those 2 men from the territorial capital, Brennan and Hastings, they were talking with Marcus Whitmore in the back room of the saloon. They thought they were being private, but the walls are thin, and Miguel and I have good ears. Frank leaned forward intently. What did they say? Jake's expression was grim. They were talking about how to handle the Mitchell problem. Brennan was saying that the sheriff was asking too many questions, and that she needed to be discouraged from pursuing certain lines of investigation. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Did they mention specifics? Whitmore was arguing that you were just a woman playing at being sheriff, and that you'd lose interest if they simply ignored you. But Brennan said that your performance today proved you were more dangerous than they had anticipated. He mentioned something about the Denver interests not being pleased with recent developments. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture, though Sarah didn't like what she was seeing. Did they mention anything about the money or the special shipment? Hastings was worried about federal authorities getting involved if the investigation continued. He said something about irregularities in the documentation that couldn't stand up to scrutiny. Sarah exchanged glances with Frank, both of them recognizing the implications of what Jake had overheard. If territorial banking officials were concerned about federal investigation, it suggested that the stolen money might not have been legitimate bank funds at all. "Jake, I need you to do something for me," Sarah said carefully. "I need you to keep watching those men, but be very careful about it. If they're involved in whatever got Tom killed, they won't hesitate to eliminate other threats. You can count on me, Sheriff," Jake replied. "Tom Mitchell was a good man who gave me a chance when others wouldn't. I owe him that much." After Jake left, Sarah and Frank spent another hour going through Tom's files, looking for any mention of irregular banking activities or connections between local business leaders and outside interests. What they found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Over the past 2 years, Tom had noted several instances of large cash transactions that didn't seem to match the economic activity in the area, as well as concerns about the influence of outside investors on local business decisions. "Look at this," Frank said, pointing to an entry from 6 months before Tom's death. He was investigating reports of money laundering through local businesses, possibly connected to mining claims that were being used to hide illegal activities. Sarah studied the entry, noting Tom's careful documentation of dates, amounts, and people involved. According to this, he suspected that someone was using the bank to clean money from criminal activities in other parts of the territory. And if that's true, Frank concluded, then the special shipment might not have been legitimate bank funds at all, but dirty money being laundered through Silverbrook's financial system. The implications were staggering. If Tom had been killed to prevent him from exposing a money laundering operation, then his death wasn't just a tragedy, but a deliberate murder designed to protect powerful interests. More troubling was the possibility that people in positions of authority within the territorial government might be involved in the conspiracy. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just days earlier. "Frank, I want you to send a telegram to the Federal Marshal Service in Denver. Request that they send an investigator to look into irregularities in banking operations in this territory." "That's a bold move, Sarah. If you're wrong about this, you could find yourself in serious trouble with territorial authorities. And if I'm right but do nothing, then Tom's killer goes free and the corruption continues," Sarah replied firmly. "I'd rather face the consequences of being wrong than live with the guilt of letting injustice prevail." As Frank prepared to leave for the telegraph office, Sarah remained at the desk, staring at the badge Tom had worn with such pride. She was beginning to understand that being sheriff involved more than just facing down outlaws and keeping the peace. Sometimes it meant challenging the very systems that were supposed to support law and order, confronting corruption wherever it might be found. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Silverbrook, riders who arrived at sunrise and went directly to the Silver Dollar Saloon without stopping at the sheriff's office. Sarah learned of their presence from Maria Santos, who had come to the office with coffee and fresh pastries, a gesture of appreciation for Sarah's role in ending the Morrison gang threat. "There are 6 of them," Maria reported, her voice tinged with concern. "Hard-looking men with expensive guns and clothes that don't match their occupation. They're asking questions about you, about what happened at Widow's Creek Station, about who you've been talking to." Sarah felt a familiar chill of danger. "What kind of questions?" The kind that suggests they're not here to congratulate you on your success, Maria replied. Miguel thinks they might be hired guns, professionals brought in to handle situations that regular outlaws can't manage. The implication was clear. If Sarah's investigation into the banking conspiracy was making powerful people nervous, they might have decided to eliminate the threat in the most direct way possible. Hired killers were expensive, but they were also effective, and $50,000 would buy a lot of professional violence. "Where's Frank?" Sarah asked, checking her weapons and making sure she had adequate ammunition. "He left for the telegraph office early this morning, but he should be back soon," Maria replied. "Sheriff, maybe you should consider leaving town for a while, until this situation resolves itself." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Tom didn't run when things got dangerous, and neither will I if these men want to finish what the Morrison gang started. They'll find out that I'm not the same woman who pinned on this badge a few days ago." As if summoned by her words, Frank Rodriguez burst through the office door, his face flushed from hard writing and his expression grim. "Sarah, we've got problems. The telegraph operator in Pine Creek told me that the lines to Denver have been cut, probably sometime during the night. Someone doesn't want us communicating with federal authorities." "It gets worse," Sarah said, filling him in on Maria's report about the hired guns. "It looks like we've stirred up a hornet's nest." Frank's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "How do you want to handle this?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the street outside. Through the window, she could see 6 riders approaching the sheriff's office, their posture and bearing confirming Maria's assessment that these were professional killers rather than ordinary outlaws. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and cold gray eyes, his appearance suggesting someone who had spent years perfecting the art of violence. His companions were equally intimidating, their faces marked by scars and their eyes holding the flat, emotionless stare of men who killed for money rather than passion. "Sheriff Mitchell," the leader called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "My name is James Blackwood, and I represent certain interests that have been affected by your recent activities. We need to have a conversation." Sarah opened the office door and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her hand resting casually on her gun butt. "Mr. Blackwood, if you have business with the sheriff's office, you're welcome to come inside and discuss it properly." Blackwood's smile was as cold as mountain snow. "I'm afraid this conversation requires privacy, Sheriff. The kind of privacy that can only be found outside of town, away from curious ears and interference. I'm not in the habit of leaving my jurisdiction to have conversations with strangers," Sarah replied calmly. "If you have something to say, say it here." "Very well," Blackwood said, his tone suggesting he had expected this response. "You've been asking questions about matters that don't concern you, Sheriff. Important people have been inconvenienced by your curiosity, and they've asked me to ensure that your investigation comes to an end." Sarah felt Frank move to a position behind her, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. She could also see movement in the buildings around the street, townsfolk taking cover but watching the confrontation with intense interest. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm investigating the murder of my husband and the corruption that led to his death. That's very much my concern as sheriff of this town." "Your husband died trying to prevent a bank robbery," Blackwood replied. "That's all there is to it. Any other theories you might have are simply the grief-stricken imaginings of a woman who should have stayed home and mourned quietly." The dismissive tone in Blackwood's voice was calculated to provoke anger, but Sarah had learned to control her emotions during dangerous situations. "Mr. Blackwood, you and your men have exactly 1 minute to leave Silverbrook, or I'll arrest you for threatening a peace officer." Blackwood's laugh was genuine but completely without humor. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand the situation. My employers have invested considerable resources in certain operations in this territory, and they won't allow those investments to be jeopardized by an amateur investigator with romantic notions about justice. "Your minute is up," Sarah said quietly. What happened next occurred with the swift, deadly precision of a choreographed dance. Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, but Sarah's Colt was already clearing leather, her hours of practice with Tom paying dividends in the split second that separated life from death. Her first shot took Blackwood in the chest, spinning him from his saddle before his weapon was fully drawn. The street erupted in gunfire as Blackwood's men opened fire. On the sheriff's office, Sarah dove for cover behind a water trough, her rifle spitting fire as she tried to even the odds. Frank's position behind the office doorway gave him a clear field of fire, and his first shots dropped two of the hired guns before they could take effective cover. The remaining three killers had found positions behind buildings and wagons, their professional training evident in their accurate, disciplined fire. Bullets shattered windows and splintered wood as the gunfight raged through the heart of Silverbrook's business district. Sarah could hear people shouting from inside the buildings, but she also heard something that gave her hope. The sound of additional gunfire from unexpected directions suggested that the townspeople were not remaining passive observers. Jake Warren's distinctive rifle spoke from the roof of the general store, while Miguel Santos and several other men were laying down covering fire from positions along the street. The tide of battle turned when one of the hired guns made the mistake of trying to flank Sarah's position. He emerged from behind a wagon directly into the sights of Doc Thompson, who had positioned himself in his office window with a hunting rifle. The doctor's shot was clean and final, reducing the odds to 2 against many. Recognizing that their position was untenable, the surviving killers attempted to retreat to their horses and escape. But Jake Warren's position on the rooftop gave him clear shots at the hitching posts, and his accurate fire spooked the horses, sending them fleeing down the street. Trapped in the middle of Main Street with no cover and no escape route, the last 2 hired guns did the only thing left to them. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, their professional composure finally cracking under the realization that they had underestimated both the sheriff they had come to kill and the community that supported her. The smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded. Sarah found herself standing in the middle of Silverbrook's main street, surrounded by the evidence of her second major gunfight in as many weeks. The hired killers lay dead or captured, their threat to her investigation ended, but she knew that the forces behind them were still at work. Frank Rodriguez approached her, his rifle still ready, but his expression showing relief and admiration. "Sarah, I've never seen anything like that. You outdrew a professional gunfighter." "Tom taught me that speed matters less than accuracy," Sarah replied, though she was still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "And that sometimes the best way to handle a threat is to meet it head-on." As the townspeople began emerging from their places of safety, Sarah could see a change in their expressions. The skepticism and doubt that had marked their faces when she first pinned on the badge were gone, replaced by respect and something that might have been awe. She had now faced down 2 separate groups of killers and emerged victorious both times, proving beyond any doubt that she was capable of protecting her community. But even as she accepted the congratulations and thanks of the townspeople, Sarah's mind was already working on the larger problem. The hired guns had been sent by someone with considerable resources and influence, someone who was willing to kill to protect their interests. The fact that they had cut the telegraph lines suggested a level of organization and planning that went far beyond simple criminal activity. Mayor Cole approached her, his earlier skepticism replaced by obvious concern. "Sheriff Mitchell, this situation has gone far beyond what our little town can handle. Perhaps it's time to seek help from territorial authorities." "The territorial authorities may be part of the problem," Sarah replied. "Those men didn't come here on their own initiative. Someone with power and influence sent them, and I don't think it was done without the knowledge of people in high places." As the bodies were removed and the street began to return to normal, Sarah realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. The forces arrayed against her were powerful and well connected, but they had also shown their hand by resorting to hired killers. That desperation suggested that she was closer to the truth than they were comfortable with. The badge on her chest caught the morning sunlight as she walked back toward the sheriff's office, its weight now familiar and comforting rather than intimidating. She had proven herself capable of handling whatever threats came her way, but she had also learned that being sheriff sometimes meant standing alone against forces that seemed overwhelming. The real question now was whether she could uncover the truth about Tom's death and the conspiracy that had led to it before those forces could regroup and strike again. The stakes were higher than ever, but Sarah Mitchell had discovered that she was equal to whatever challenges lay ahead, regardless of how dangerous they might be. The aftermath of the street gunfight brought unexpected visitors to Silverbrook within 24 hours. Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived on the afternoon train, accompanied by 2 deputies and a territorial prosecutor named Jonathan Pierce. Unlike the banking officials who had tried to intimidate Sarah days earlier, these men carried themselves with the quiet authority of those who answered to higher powers than local political interests. Marshal Hayes was a weathered man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough corruption to recognize it in all its forms. He found Sarah in the sheriff's office, where she was carefully documenting the events of the gunfight and the investigation that had led to it. The office bore the scars of recent violence, bullet holes in the walls serving as reminders of how far her enemies were willing to go. "Sheriff Mitchell," Marshal Hayes said, removing his hat as he entered. "I'm sorry for your loss, both personal and professional. Your husband was known throughout the territory as an honest lawman, and his death was felt far beyond Silverbrook." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, noting the genuine respect in the marshal's voice. "Thank you, Marshal. I assume you're here about more than offering condolences." "You assume correctly," Hayes replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "We've been investigating irregularities in banking operations throughout the Colorado Territory for the past year. Your husband's death was one of several incidents that suggested organized criminal activity, but until recently, we lacked the evidence to prove our suspicions." "And now you have that evidence?" Hayes smiled grimly. "We have James Blackwood, one of the most notorious hired killers in the West, and his surviving associates in federal custody. Men like Blackwood don't work cheap, and they don't take contracts without substantial guarantees of payment. Someone with serious money and influence wanted you dead, Sheriff, and that kind of desperation usually means we're close to exposing something significant." Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. Her investigation had indeed uncovered something important, but the forces arrayed against her were more powerful than she had imagined. "What kind of criminal activity are we talking about, Marshal?" "Money laundering on a massive scale," Hayes replied. "Someone has been using banks throughout the territory to clean money from illegal mining operations, cattle rustling, and other criminal enterprises. The operation is sophisticated enough to require cooperation from banking officials, territorial administrators, and local law enforcement. The implications were staggering. If federal authorities were correct, then Tom's death had been part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government." Sarah thought about the nervous behavior of the banking officials who had visited her office, their eagerness to recover the stolen money, and their obvious fear when she had pressed for details. "Where does the investigation stand now?" Sarah asked. "We're preparing to make arrests," Hayes said. "But we need your cooperation, Sheriff. Your husband kept meticulous records, and your recent investigation has provided crucial pieces of the puzzle. With your testimony and the evidence you've gathered, we can bring down the entire operation." Sarah opened her desk drawer and withdrew the collection of documents and notes she had assembled over the past week. Tom's careful observations, the financial records she had obtained from various sources, and her own investigation into the Morrison gang's activities painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond Silverbrook. "Marshal, "There's something else you should know," Sarah said, handing over the documents. "I believe this special shipment that was stolen during the bank robbery wasn't legitimate bank funds. The money recovered from the Morrison gang showed signs of having been buried or hidden for extended periods, and the serial numbers on some of the bills don't match the records provided by the Banking Commission." Hayes examined the documents with growing interest. "This supports our theory that the robbery was an inside job, designed to steal evidence of the money laundering operation rather than just enriching the gang members. Someone wanted that money to disappear," Sarah continued, "and they were willing to kill my husband to ensure it happened. When the Morrison gang failed to complete their mission, the conspiracy decided to eliminate me as well." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Rodriguez, who entered the office with obvious excitement. "Sheriff, Marshal, you need to see this," he said, holding up a telegram. "This just came in from the Federal Marshal's office in Denver." Hayes read the telegram quickly, his expression growing more serious with each line. "Sheriff Mitchell, it appears that your investigation has had consequences beyond Silverbrook. Federal agents in Denver have arrested 3 territorial banking officials, including Charles Brennan, on charges of conspiracy and money laundering." Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The arrest of corrupt officials was a victory for justice, but it also meant that her enemies might become more desperate and dangerous. "What happens now?" "Now we finish what your husband started," Hayes replied firmly. "We're going to arrest every person involved in this conspiracy, from the hired guns to the politicians who protected them. But Sheriff, I need you to understand that this investigation is far from over. The people behind this operation have resources and connections that extend beyond the Colorado territory." Over the next 3 days, Silverbrook became the center of the largest federal law enforcement operation in the territory's history. Teams of federal agents arrived to coordinate arrests, gather evidence, and protect witnesses. The town's hotel filled with prosecutors, investigators, and territorial officials who had come to oversee the dismantling of the corruption network. Sarah found herself at the center of this activity, her knowledge of local conditions and her husband's investigation making her an invaluable resource for the federal agents. But she also discovered that her role as sheriff involved more than just assisting with the larger investigation. The people of Silverbrook looked to her for guidance and reassurance during this chaotic period, trusting her to protect their interests while the territorial government reorganized itself. The breakthrough came when Marcus Whitmore, the bank president, was arrested attempting to flee to Mexico with a suitcase full of cash and incriminating documents. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence, Whitmore agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. For over 2 years, a network of corrupt officials had been using territorial banks to launder money from criminal operations throughout the West. The scheme involved falsifying records, creating fictitious mining claims, and manipulating land sales to provide apparent legitimate sources for illegal funds. Tom Mitchell had been killed because his investigation was getting too close to exposing the operation. The Morrison gang had been hired not just to rob the bank, but to eliminate specific evidence that would have revealed the money laundering scheme. When they failed to complete their mission and were eliminated by Sarah, the conspiracy had turned to professional killers to finish the job. "Your husband died protecting more than just the money in that bank," Marshal Hayes told Sarah as they reviewed Whitmore's confession. "He died protecting the integrity of law enforcement throughout the territory. His investigation provided the foundation for everything we've accomplished here." Sarah felt tears threatening as she thought about Tom's dedication to justice, his willingness to risk everything for principles that seemed abstract to many people. He always said that being a peace officer meant standing between innocent people and those who would harm them, regardless of how powerful the threats might be. "He was right," Hayes replied. and you've proven yourself worthy of carrying on his work. The arrests continued throughout the week, reaching into the territorial capital and even affecting officials in Washington. The scope of the corruption network shocked even experienced federal investigators, revealing connections between territorial politics, mining interests, and criminal organizations that spanned multiple states and territories. For Sarah, the most satisfying arrest was that of Sheriff Bert Hawkins from Pine Creek, the man who had tried to intimidate her into abandoning her investigation. Hawkins had been receiving regular payments to ignore certain criminal activities in his jurisdiction and to share intelligence with the corruption network about federal investigations. Justice has a way of finding those who think they're above the law, Sarah told Frank Rodriguez as they watched Hawkins being led away in shackles. Tom always believed that, even when it seemed like the corrupt officials would never face consequences. As the immediate crisis subsided and the federal investigation moved into its final phases, Sarah found herself facing a different kind of challenge. Several territorial officials had approached her about accepting a promotion to federal marshal, recognizing that her investigation and law enforcement skills made her valuable to the broader fight against corruption. The offer was tempting, providing opportunities for advancement and influence that would have been unimaginable for a woman just months earlier. But it would also mean leaving Silverbrook, abandoning the community that had come to trust and depend on her leadership. The decision became easier when she realized that her true calling wasn't in pursuing criminals across the vast territories, but in building and protecting the kind of community that Tom had envisioned. Silverbrook had the potential to become a model of honest governance and effective law enforcement, a place where justice prevailed over corruption and where ordinary people could build better lives for themselves and their families. "I'm honored by the offer," she told Marshal Hayes when he formally presented the federal position, "but my place is here, as Sheriff of Silverbrook. This community gave me a chance to prove myself when others doubted, and I intend to repay that trust by serving them to the best of my ability." Hayes smiled with obvious approval. "I thought you might say that, Sheriff. Your husband would be proud of your decision. Building strong local law enforcement is just as important as federal investigations when it comes to fighting corruption." The final resolution came when the territorial governor, under pressure from federal authorities and public outrage over the corruption revelations, announced comprehensive reforms to banking oversight and law enforcement procedures. New safeguards were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had cost Tom Mitchell his life, and federal funding was allocated to strengthen local sheriff departments throughout the territory. Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy made her something of a celebrity throughout the Colorado territory, with newspapers from Denver to Pueblo carrying stories about the widow sheriff who had brought down a vast criminal network. But the attention that mattered most to her came from the people of Silverbrook, who had seen firsthand her dedication to justice and her willingness to risk everything to protect their community. 6 months after pinning on Tom's badge, Sarah stood once again at his grave on the hill overlooking Silverbrook. But this time, she wasn't seeking guidance or questioning her ability to fill his shoes. She was reporting on a job well done, a promise kept, and a legacy honored. "The corruption network has been destroyed," she told the simple granite headstone. "Every person involved in your death has been brought to justice, and the territorial government has implemented reforms that will prevent this kind of conspiracy from taking root again." The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers as she continued her one-sided conversation with the man she had loved and lost. "Silverbrook is becoming the kind of community you dreamed about, Tom, a place where honest people can build good lives, where justice prevails over corruption, and where the law protects the innocent rather than serving the powerful." As she prepared to leave the cemetery, Sarah noticed a figure approaching through the morning mist. Jake Warren emerged from the tree line, his quiet demeanor unchanged, but his eyes holding a warmth that hadn't been there when they first met during the crisis with the Morrison gang. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Beautiful day for remembering good people." Sarah smiled, noting how natural it felt to have Jake's company during these quiet moments. Over the months since Tom's death, Jake had become more than just an ally in law enforcement matters. His steady presence and quiet wisdom had provided comfort during the darkest periods of her investigation, and his obvious respect for her abilities had helped her develop confidence in her role as sheriff. "It is indeed," she replied. Tom would have enjoyed a morning like this, especially knowing that justice has been served and the community is safe. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "He'd also be proud of what you've accomplished, Sarah. Taking down that corruption network was more than most experienced lawmen could have managed." "I had help," Sarah reminded him. "Good people who were willing to stand up for what was right when it mattered most." "That's what makes a strong community," Jake agreed. "People who support each other and work together for the common good." As they walked down the hill toward Silverbrook, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that first day when she had demanded the right to serve as sheriff. She had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed, faced dangers that would have terrified her months earlier, and earned the respect of a community that had initially doubted her abilities. More importantly, she had found a sense of purpose that went beyond simply wearing Tom's badge or seeking revenge for his death. Being sheriff meant being a guardian of justice, a protector of the innocent, and a symbol of hope for those who believed that right could triumph over might when good people were willing to stand up and fight. The town spread out before them. As they reached the edge of the residential area, smoke rising from chimneys and people beginning their daily routines with the confidence that came from knowing their community was safe and well protected. Children played in the streets without fear. Merchants opened their shops with the assurance that law and order would be maintained, and families planned their futures with the knowledge that corruption and violence would not be tolerated. "Sheriff," Jake said as they approached the main street, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Sarah looked at him with curiosity, noting a slight nervousness in his usually calm demeanor. "What is it, Jake?" "Well," he began, then stopped and removed his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. "I was wondering if you might consider allowing me to court you properly. I know it might seem inappropriate, given everything that's happened and your position as sheriff, but I've come to care for you deeply, and I wanted you to know my intentions are honorable." The question caught Sarah completely off guard, though she realized that she had been aware of Jake's growing feelings for some time. His gentle attentions during the difficult months, his unwavering support during the dangerous investigations, and his obvious respect for her abilities had not gone unnoticed. "Jake," she said softly, "I'm honored by your feelings, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't come to care for you as well. But I need you to understand that being sheriff is more than just a job for me. It's become my calling, my way of honoring Tom's memory and serving this community. Any relationship would have to respect that commitment." Jake's smile was warm and genuine. "Sarah, I fell in love with the woman who stood up to the Morrison gang, who faced down corrupt officials and hired killers, who refused to be intimidated by men who thought she didn't belong in a position of authority. I wouldn't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's heart, a part of her that had been closed off since Tom's death. The possibility of love, of companionship, of building a life with someone who understood and respected her dedication to law enforcement had seemed impossible until this moment. "In that case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I would be pleased to accept your attentions, Mr. Warren, though I should warn you that courting a sheriff might be more complicated than courting an ordinary woman." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Jake replied, offering his arm as they continued toward the sheriff's office. As they walked together through the morning sunshine, Sarah felt a sense of completeness that had been missing since Tom's death. She had honored his memory by bringing his killers to justice. She had proven herself worthy of the badge he had worn with such pride. And she had built the kind of community they had both dreamed about. Now, for the first time since becoming sheriff, she was allowing herself to imagine a future that included not just duty and service, but love and companionship as well. It seemed fitting that this new chapter would begin in Silverbrook, the town that had given her a chance to prove herself and had supported her through the most challenging period of her life. The badge on her chest caught the morning light as she and Jake approached the sheriff's office, where Deputy Rodriguez was already preparing for another day of keeping the peace in a community that had learned to trust in justice. The weight of the badge was familiar now, no longer a burden but a symbol of authority earned through courage, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent. Sheriff Sarah Mitchell had become exactly what Silverbrook needed, exactly what Tom Mitchell would have wanted her to become. She was a law officer who understood that true strength came not from the ability to outdraw professional gunfighters or face down dangerous criminals, but from the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As she settled behind her desk to begin another day of serving her community, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The widow who had pinned on her husband's badge in desperation and grief had become a sheriff who commanded respect throughout the territory. The woman who had been dismissed as playing dress-up with a man's job had proven that justice knew no gender, only the difference between those who would protect the innocent and those who would prey upon them. The future stretched ahead full of possibilities, both professional and personal. There would be new challenges to face, new threats to the peace and prosperity of Silverbrook, new opportunities to serve the cause of justice. But there would also be the chance to build a life of love and companionship with a man who understood and respected her calling. Sheriff Sarah Mitchell was ready for whatever came next, confident in her abilities and secure in the knowledge that she had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her by the people of Silverbrook. The badge she wore was no longer her husband's, but her own, earned through fire and blood and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught, only discovered when circumstances demanded nothing less than everything a person had to give. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountains surrounding Silverbrook, promising another day of peace and prosperity in a community where justice prevailed and good people could live without fear. Sheriff Sarah Mitchell had made that promise a reality, and she would continue to protect it for as long as the people of Silverbrook needed her service. The autumn of 1883 brought changes to Silverbrook that no one could have anticipated when Sarah Mitchell first pinned on her husband's badge 15 months earlier. The railroad had expanded its operations, bringing a steady stream of legitimate businessmen and families seeking opportunities in the growing territory. The Silver Dollar Saloon had been renovated and now catered to a more respectable clientele, while new shops and services opened regularly along Main Street to serve the expanding community. Sarah stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the morning activity with a sense of deep satisfaction. The town had tripled in size since the corruption network's destruction, but it had maintained the character and values that she and Tom had always envisioned. Law and order prevailed, honest business flourished, and children played safely in streets that had once echoed with gunfire. The badge on her chest had been replaced 6 months earlier with one specially crafted by the territorial government, recognizing her permanent appointment as sheriff and her role in the largest anti-corruption operation in Colorado Territory's history. The new badge was slightly larger than Tom's had been, engraved with her own name and the seal of the territory, but she had kept his original badge in a place of honor in their home, a reminder of the man whose legacy had guided her through the darkest periods of her service. Deputy Rodriguez approached from the direction of the telegraph office, carrying a message that bore the official seal of the Federal Marshal Service. Frank had become more than just her deputy over the past year. developing into a trusted friend and advisor whose experience complemented her instincts and determination. The partnership they had forged during the dangerous months of investigation and conflict had evolved into one of the most effective law enforcement teams in the territory. "Sheriff," Frank said, handing her the telegram. "This came in from Marshal Hayes in Denver. Looks like it might be important." Sarah unfolded the message and read it twice before the full implications registered. Federal authorities were requesting her assistance with a new investigation. This one centered on cattle rustling operations that appeared to involve some of the same criminal networks they had dismantled in Silverbrook. More intriguingly, the telegram suggested that her unique experience with corruption cases made her an ideal candidate for a special federal appointment that would give her jurisdiction throughout the Colorado territory. "Good news or bad news?" Frank asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "Complicated news," Sarah replied, folding the telegram and slipping it into her pocket. "It seems our reputation has spread farther than I realized. The federal marshals want me to take on a broader role in fighting organized crime throughout the territory." Frank whistled softly. "That's quite an honor, Sheriff. Not many local peace officers get offers like that." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already working through the implications of such an appointment. It would mean traveling extensively, spending weeks or months away from Silverbrook, and taking on cases that could be even more dangerous than what she had already faced. More personally, it would complicate her relationship with Jake Warren, which had developed into something deeper and more meaningful than either of them had initially expected. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street, where a small group of riders was making its way toward the sheriff's office. Sarah recognized the lead rider as Judge William Crawford, the circuit judge who had presided over many of the corruption trials that had resulted from her investigation. Behind him rode two men she didn't immediately recognize, both wearing the distinctive clothing and bearing of federal officials. Judge Crawford dismounted and approached the office with the measured dignity that characterized all his actions. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and keen blue eyes that had seen enough of human nature to judge character accurately. His presence in Silverbrook usually meant important legal business, and his expression suggested that today would be no exception. "Sheriff Mitchell," Judge Crawford said, removing his hat respectfully, "I hope we find you well. I'd like you to meet Assistant Attorney General Robert Hancock from Washington and Territorial Administrator Charles Peterson from Denver. They've come quite a distance to speak with you." Sarah invited the three men into her office, noting the way the federal official studied her with obvious curiosity. She had grown accustomed to such attention over the past year, as her reputation had spread throughout law enforcement circles across the West. Stories of the widow sheriff who had brought down a territorial corruption network had reached as far as Washington, apparently generating interest at the highest levels of government. Assistant Attorney General Hancock was a distinguished man. In his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant authority. His companion Peterson appeared younger and more nervous, clearly awed by the opportunity to meet the woman, whose investigations had resulted in federal prosecutions reaching into multiple territories. "Sheriff Mitchell," Hancock began after they were seated, "your work in exposing the banking conspiracy has had ramifications far beyond Colorado territory. The criminal networks you helped dismantle had connections throughout the West, and your investigative methods have become a model for federal law enforcement agencies." Sarah accepted the compliment with appropriate modesty, though she felt a surge of pride at the recognition of her professional abilities. "I was simply doing my job, Mr. Hancock. My husband's murder demanded justice, and the investigation led where it led." "Your husband's murder was indeed the catalyst," Hancock agreed. "But your subsequent work has demonstrated investigative skills and courage that are rare in any law enforcement officer, regardless of gender. That's why we're here today." Judge Crawford leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "Sarah, the federal government is offering you an appointment as a special territorial marshal, with jurisdiction throughout Colorado territory and the authority to investigate criminal conspiracies wherever they might lead." The offer was even more significant than the telegram had suggested, representing a level of authority and responsibility that would have been unimaginable for any woman just a few years earlier. Sarah felt a mixture of honor and apprehension as she considered the implications of such a position. "What would such an appointment entail?" she asked carefully. Peterson spoke for the first time, his voice betraying his excitement about the proposal. "You would maintain your base in Silverbrook, but you would have the authority to pursue investigations throughout the territory. Your primary focus would be on organized criminal activity, corruption cases, and situations that require coordination between local and federal authorities. Essentially," Hancock added, "you would become the federal government's primary representative for fighting organized crime in one of the most important territories in the West. The position would come with significant resources, additional deputies, and direct communication with Washington when necessary." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, considering the offer and its potential impact on her life and relationships. The professional opportunity was extraordinary, offering the chance to expand her influence in the fight for justice throughout the region. But it would also mean increased danger, longer separations from Silverbrook, and complications for her personal relationships. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities, but I need time to consider such a significant decision. Can you give me a few days to think it over?" "Of course," Hancock replied. "Take all the time you need. We'll be staying at the hotel for the remainder of the week, so there's no rush for an immediate answer." After the federal officials left, Sarah found herself alone with Judge Crawford, who had remained behind with obvious intent to discuss the situation privately. The judge had been a mentor and friend throughout the corruption trials, offering guidance and support during some of the most challenging periods of her career. "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked, trusting his judgment and experience. Judge Crawford was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, you've already accomplished more than most peace officers achieve in entire careers. You've brought justice to your husband's killers, dismantled a major criminal network, and established yourself as one of the most effective law enforcement officers in the territory. But," Sarah prompted, sensing hesitation in his voice, "but you also have personal considerations that didn't exist when you first took on this role," the judge continued. "Your relationship with Jake Warren has become serious, and the federal position would place considerable strain on that relationship. You also have roots in Silverbrook now, connections and responsibilities that matter." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the complexity of her situation. Over the past year, Jake had become far more than just a romantic interest. He had become her closest confidant, her strongest supporter, and the person she turned to when the weight of responsibility became overwhelming. Their relationship had developed naturally and steadily, built on mutual respect, shared values, and deep affection. "There's also the question of what kind of life you want to build for yourself," Judge Crawford added. "The federal position would be prestigious and important, but it would also be demanding and dangerous. You'd be traveling constantly, facing new threats regularly, and carrying responsibilities that few people could handle. Whereas staying in Silverbrook would mean building the kind of community and life that you and Tom always dreamed about," the judge finished. "Raising a family, if that's what you choose, in a place where justice prevails and good people can flourish. There's honor in that choice as well, Sarah." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Warren, who had come to the office as he did most afternoons to escort Sarah home for dinner. His presence immediately lifted Sarah's spirits, as it always did, reminding her of the warmth and companionship that had entered her life over the past year. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Jake said with the smile that never failed to make her heart skip slightly, "Judge Crawford, good to see you again." "Jake," the judge replied warmly. "I was just discussing some career opportunities with the sheriff. Perhaps you should be part of this conversation." Sarah quickly explained the federal appointment offer, watching Jake's face carefully for his reaction. She saw pride in his expression, obvious satisfaction that her abilities were being recognized at the highest levels of government. But she also saw something else, a flicker of concern about what such an appointment might mean for their relationship and their future together. "That's an incredible honor," Jake said when she finished explaining. "The federal government doesn't make offers like that lightly. You must be very proud." "I am," Sarah admitted, "but I'm also uncertain about what accepting would mean for everything else in my life." Jake was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful as he considered his response. "Sarah, when I first asked for permission to court you, I told you that I fell in love with the woman who stood up to dangerous men and refused to be intimidated by those who thought she didn't belong in a position of authority. That hasn't changed, but I also hope that our relationship means something to you, that the life we've been building together has value beyond just personal satisfaction." His voice was careful, free of pressure or manipulation, but honest about his feelings and hopes. Sarah felt her heart constrict as she recognized the fundamental choice she was facing. The federal appointment represented professional advancement and the opportunity to fight injustice on a broader scale. But it would also mean sacrificing the personal happiness and stability she had found in Silverbrook, the sense of home and belonging that had sustained her through the most difficult periods of her life. "Jake," she said softly, "our relationship means everything to me. You've given me hope for a future I thought was impossible after Tom's death. But I also have a responsibility to use my abilities in service of justice, and this appointment would allow me to help people throughout the territory." "Then maybe the answer isn't choosing one or the other," Judge Crawford interjected thoughtfully. "Maybe the answer is finding a way to honor both commitments." Sarah looked at the judge with curiosity, wondering what alternative he might be suggesting. Over the past year, she had come to trust his wisdom and insight, particularly when it came to balancing competing obligations and responsibilities. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that the federal government needs effective law enforcement officers, but it also needs those officers to be rooted in the communities they serve," Judge Crawford explained. "What if you accepted the appointment but negotiated terms that would allow you to maintain your base in Silverbrook and your commitment to this community?" Jake's expression brightened slightly as he considered the judge's suggestion. "Would that be possible? Could you accept federal appointment but still live here most of the time?" "It would depend on the specific terms and the willingness of federal authorities to accommodate such an arrangement," Sarah replied, though she found herself intrigued by the possibility. "But it might be worth exploring." The next morning, Sarah requested a private meeting with Assistant Attorney General Hancock to discuss the possibility of modified terms for the federal appointment. She found him in the hotel dining room, reviewing documents while enjoying breakfast, and he invited her to join him for coffee while they talked. "Mr. Hancock," Sarah began, "I'm interested in the federal appointment, but I have concerns about the impact it might have on my personal life and my commitment to Silverbrook. I was wondering if there might be flexibility in how the position is structured." Hancock set down his coffee cup and studied her with obvious interest. "What kind of flexibility are you thinking about, Sheriff?" "I'd like to maintain my base here in Silverbrook, with the understanding that I would travel throughout the territory as needed for federal investigations. But I'd want the majority of my time to be spent here, serving this community and building the kind of life I've worked to create." "That's an interesting proposal," Hancock mused. "It would actually fit well with our long-term strategy for territorial law enforcement. We want federal marshals who are connected to local communities, who understand the people and conditions they're working to protect." Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized that her request might not be as impossible as she had initially thought. Would such an arrangement be acceptable to federal authorities? I think it could be, Hancock replied. You would still have full federal authority and the resources that come with the appointment, but you would use Silverbrook as your headquarters rather than traveling constantly. It might actually be more effective than a traditional federal marshal position. They spent the next hour working out the details of such an arrangement, with Sarah proposing specific terms that would allow her to maintain her commitment to both federal service and local community. The conversation was productive and encouraging, leaving her optimistic that she could find a way to honor both her professional calling and her personal relationships. That evening, Sarah met with Jake at their favorite spot overlooking the town, a small hill where they often went to watch the sunset and talk about their future together. The autumn air was crisp and clear, with the mountains surrounding Silverbrook painted in brilliant colors by the changing leaves. I spoke with Hancock today about modifying the federal appointment, Sarah told Jake as they settled on a fallen log that had become their customary seat. He seems receptive to the idea of letting me maintain my base here while taking on broader responsibilities throughout the territory. Jake's relief was evident in his expression. That sounds like it could work for both of us. You'd still be able to serve the cause of justice on a larger scale, but we wouldn't have to sacrifice the life we've been building together. It would mean some travel, Sarah warned, and probably some dangerous situations. Federal investigations tend to involve more serious criminals and higher stakes than local law enforcement. I understand that, Jake replied, taking her hand in his. I've always known that loving you meant accepting the risks that come with your profession. But as long as Silverbrook remains your home, as long as you're committed to building a life here with me, I can handle whatever challenges come with your work. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she realized that she didn't have to choose between professional fulfillment and personal happiness. With Jake's support and the federal government's flexibility, she could create a life that honored both her calling as a law enforcement officer and her desire for love and companionship. Jake, she said, turning to face him fully, there's something else I need to tell you. Over the past year, you've become the most important person in my life. You've given me strength when I was weak, hope when I was discouraged, and love when I thought I'd never feel that way again. Sarah, Jake began, but she placed a finger gently against his lips. Let me finish, she continued, her voice soft but determined. I want to accept the federal appointment, but I also want to accept something else. If you're still interested in making our relationship permanent, I'd be honored to become your wife. Jake's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and joy that words couldn't express. For several minutes they held each other in the gathering twilight, two people who had found love and purpose in the midst of danger and uncertainty. I've been carrying this around for weeks, Jake said eventually, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box. I was waiting for the right moment to propose, but you've beaten me to it. Inside the box was a simple but beautiful ring, a gold band set with a small diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. It was exactly the kind of ring Sarah would have chosen for herself, elegant but practical, beautiful but not ostentatious. It was my grandmother's, Jake explained as he slipped it onto her finger. She was a strong woman who helped build a life in difficult circumstances. I thought you might appreciate the connection. Sarah admired the ring on her hand, marveling at how right it felt to be wearing Jake's grandmother's jewelry. The ring represented not just their commitment to each other, but her acceptance into his family and their shared future in Silverbrook. When do you want to have the ceremony? Jake asked as they began walking back toward town. Soon, Sarah replied without hesitation. I've learned that life is too uncertain to postpone important decisions. If we're going to build a life together, let's start as soon as possible. They decided on a wedding date 6 weeks in the future. which would give Sarah time to finalize the terms of her federal appointment and allow for proper planning of the ceremony. The news of their engagement spread through Silverbrook within hours, generating excitement and approval from a community that had watched their relationship develop with obvious satisfaction. Mayor Cole, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's appointment as sheriff, was among the first to offer congratulations and assistance with wedding planning. "Sheriff Mitchell," he said when he stopped by the office the next morning, "I have to admit that when you first demanded the right to wear that badge, I thought you were making a mistake. I was wrong about that, and I couldn't be happier about your engagement to Jake. He's a fine man, and you deserve all the happiness in the world." The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with activity as Sarah worked to finalize her federal appointment while planning for the most important personal event of her life. Assistant Attorney General Hancock proved surprisingly accommodating about the terms of her new position, agreeing to an arrangement that would allow her to maintain her headquarters in Silverbrook while taking on cases throughout the territory as needed. The federal government benefits from having marshals who are connected to local communities, Hancock explained when they signed the final paperwork. "Your success here in Silverbrook proves that you understand how to build trust and cooperation between different levels of law enforcement." The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp November morning, with the entire community of Silverbrook turning out to celebrate the union of their sheriff and one of their most respected citizens. Judge Crawford performed the ceremony in the town's small church, while Deputy Rodriguez served as Jake's best man and Maria Santos as Sarah's matron of honor. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her, while Jake wore a new suit that had been specially ordered from Denver for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but elegant, reflecting the practical nature of both bride and groom while acknowledging the importance of the vows they were taking. "Do you, Sarah Mitchell, take Jake Warren to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Judge Crawford asked. "I do," Sarah replied, her voice clear and confident. "And do you, Jake Warren, take Sarah Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake responded, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was gentle but passionate, sealing a commitment that had been built on shared values, mutual respect, and deep love. As they turned to face the congregation, Sarah saw tears of joy in the eyes of people who had become her extended family, friends who had supported her through the most challenging and dangerous period of her life. The reception was held in the town hall, with food provided by volunteers and music supplied by a small group of local musicians. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing, toasts, and stories about the couple who had brought together two of Silverbrook's most respected citizens. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Sarah found herself standing with Jake on the steps of the town hall, looking out over the community that had become their home. The streets were quiet now, lit by lamplight and moonlight, peaceful and secure in a way that would have been impossible before the corruption network was dismantled. "No regrets?" Jake asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "None at all," Sarah replied, leaning into his embrace. "This feels exactly right, exactly what was meant to happen, even with the federal appointment and all the travel it will require." Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "Especially with the federal appointment. I'll be able to fight injustice throughout the territory while maintaining our life here in Silverbrook. It's the best of both worlds." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who had found love and purpose in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. The badge on Sarah's chest caught the moonlight, a symbol of authority earned through courage and dedication. while the ring on her finger represented the personal happiness she had discovered with a man who understood and supported her calling. "Mrs. Warren," Jake said softly, testing out her new name. "Sheriff Warren," Sarah corrected with a smile. "I think I'll keep my professional name for law enforcement purposes, but I like the sound of Mrs. Warren for everything else." As they walked home together through the quiet streets of Silverbrook, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been a grieving widow demanding the right to seek justice for her husband's murder. Now she was a federal marshal with jurisdiction throughout the territory, a wife beginning a new chapter of personal happiness, and a woman who had proven that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. The house that she and Jake had chosen together was modest but comfortable, a place where they could build the kind of life that honored both their professional commitments and their personal relationships. As they settled into their new routine as husband and wife, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with the same strength and determination that had brought them through the dangerous months of investigation and conflict. The badge she wore was no longer a burden or a symbol of grief, but a representation of her commitment to justice and her ability to protect the innocent. The ring on her finger was a promise of love and companionship that would sustain her through whatever difficulties the future might bring. Most importantly, the life she had built in Silverbrook was proof that sometimes the most unlikely person could become exactly the hero a community needed, and that justice and love could flourish even in the hardest circumstances. Sheriff Sarah Warren had earned her place in the history of Colorado Territory, not just as a law enforcement officer who had brought down a major criminal conspiracy, but as a woman who had proven that courage, determination, and integrity knew no gender. Her story would inspire other women to seek positions of authority and responsibility, while her example of balancing professional duty with personal happiness would show that it was possible to serve the cause of justice without sacrificing the relationships that made life meaningful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.